Welcome back to Rise to Liberty podcast. Today I am joined by Ken Silva. He has been covering some craziness lately, including the most recent incident happening with Trump. And so we might touch on that just a little bit, although that is not what we are here today for. So, how you doing today, Ken?
I'm doing well, but I'm hearing kind of a little. I'm hearing twice,
Oh, weird. Let's see here.
and now I'm hearing myself speak.
Is that better?
Let's see. Yeah, I think we're good now.
Okay, good. Let me know if there's anything.
Nope, I'm like a 10-second delay, and then I hear you again. Hear your initial voice.
Oh, weird. Let's see. Of course, we would have issues. So, the audience, let me know if you guys can hear anything. I'm going to work on that. Do you hear yourself when double?
Yeah, I can hear myself talk too.
Do you have an extra mic or speakers on your side?
Let's see if unplugging my headphones does anything.
Check.
I hope it's still coming in double.
Weird. Well, I don't
know
have
if you can
anything
hear
on.
it now.
I can't hear it on my end. Nobody has let me know in the chat as far as if it's double on their end. So we're just trying to make sure all of you fine people have the best audio possible. Also, a double mic is not something anyone can listen to. That's terrible.
Let me leave and come in and see if that does anything.
Okay, perfect. All right. So in the meantime, okay, good to know. So in the meantime, what we will do. So today we will be discussing Patcon. We're going to get into the history of the FBI and their involvement in counterterrorism. Patcon. Let's see here. All right, is that any better?
Yeah, and I'm so stupid. I'm sorry. I clicked on the YouTube link you sent me, and so I was listening to the show while I was talking to you. So
that makes a lot more sense.
Start. That's my bad.
No, you are good. Okay, it does sound better on my end as well. So I think we are good to go.
All right.
So, all right. So, Ken, how you doing?
I'm better now. Much better now.
All right.
Thanks for your patience.
Hey, anytime. So let's just dive straight into it. Who are you?
Sure. I'm a reporter. I've been a reporter for about a dozen years now. But I've only been doing politics in this national news for maybe 2 years. I started off locally in Ohio, got a job real quickly in the Caribbean after about a year. I thought I'd maybe spend a year or two down there before I, went back to America to launch my career in earnest, but ended up spending 8 years in the Caribbean and kind of just messing around and working at various newspapers until I came back in 2021. And around that time, we were talking off camera. I read a book called Aberration in the Heartland of the Real, which is sort of this like 800-page, super deep biography of Timothy McVey. And that led me kind of down this journey of reporting on FBI corruption and malfeasance and just overall, terrorizing the local population in America. And I've kind of made that into my beat over the last 2 years or so.
So what was it that drew you to the subject of the Oklahoma City bombing?
So I had been a Ron Paul guy since 2008, and I listened to some podcasts with Scott Horton where he'd play old audio of the people talking about explosives being in the building and early reporting like that. So I was kind of like always skeptical of government. And then I just saw a bunch of people talking on Twitter about this book, Aberration. And to be honest, it was like as simple enough as the cover looked really cool. It was like Timmy the McVey, but he's got a demon horns and kind of a snake running through his skull. And I bought the book on Kindle. I was in Brazil at the time, and I think I read like the first night I read like 6 hours straight from like midnight to 6 in the morning. Like I couldn't put it down. And I've been reading or writing or talking about that case and everything surrounding it pretty much ever since, for over the last 2.5 years now or so.
So the Oklahoma City bombing actually does tie into the overall topic in which we're going to cover today. Um, but before we get into that, okay, Patcon. What is Patcon? What should people know? What's the time frame that we're talking about here?
Okay, yeah. So our main subject today is Patcon, which was an undercover FBI operation entailing uh, undercover FBI agents pretending to be Nazi bank robbers. And this technically it ran as an official operation from 1991 to 1993, but a lot of the same undercover agents and informants were active for a much longer time period than that. It ties into the Oklahoma City bombing, Ruby Ridge, Waco, and I'm sure we'll get into that. But I guess that would be the simplest, Patcon in a nutshell. It never, a lot of people don't know about it because it never resulted in any major arrests. So it would essentially, you just had these undercover FBI agents roaming the country, spying on other groups, and there's no criminal case made from it. So it was essentially a giant domestic surveillance operation on America's far right wing.
So what was the justification for like starting the program?
That's a great question. And I'll give you a little bit of the backstory for how Patcon was launched in the first place. And so in the 1980s, there actually was some legitimately dangerous and organic right-wing terrorism. And basically, this is born out of the atmosphere of the early 80s when Paul Volcker, I know a lot of libertarians like to talk about how Paul Volcker, the Federal Reserve chairman, defeated inflation by jacking up interest rates. And that's true, and it was a necessary measure, but he actually triggered something called the farm crisis in the 80s. It wasn't a mortgage crisis in 2008 or savings loans in the late 80s. This manifested itself in the farming crisis. And at one point, you had a farm a day closing down for like 2 or 3 years in the Midwest. And a lot of these guys became radical right wingers as a result. One particular guy who I've written a lot about was Gordon Call. He became a tax protester. He was traveling the country telling all his buddies about how the income tax is unconstitutional. It funds things antithetical to our values. It's funding all these foreign wars and abortion and other things we disagree with. And so I'm not going to pay taxes. I'm not going to fund this. And basically, the government targeted him for his political views. They tried to set up a roadblock with U.S. Marshals to capture him in the early 80s. He got into a shoot-off, killed 2 of the U.S. Marshals, became a fugitive in like the right-wing underground for a good 3 or 4 months. He kind of became a hero, and the FBI eventually caught him and basically Waco'd him. They burnt him to death, from my understanding of what happened, investigating the case. And it was in response to Gordon Call's death that a group, the very next month, a group called the Order was created, where all these, you want to call them neo-Nazis or white nationalists or whatever, but they launched an actual terrorist group that its explicit goal was robbing banks to fund a right-wing revolution, and they cited Gordon Call as one of the reasons that they were doing what they were. So the FBI takes out the order, but in doing so, they create a giant domestic counterterrorism apparatus. And I believe Patcon was basically a continuation of that, where they took out the order and now they've got millions of dollars of funding from Congress, but not much really to do with it. And so they kind of have to create their own right wing domestic terrorism problems for them to present the solution to justify the giant budget that they had coming out of the 80s. That's kind of my theory of why it was launched.
And then, of course, there is nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. And so it kind of just never went away, it sounds like.
Yeah, that's probably the most charitable explanation I could give. The other one you could say is the FBI took out the order, but they tried to prosecute a lot of people connected to the order. They actually had like the first sedition trial at that point since World War II. I know people are used to sedition trials now with the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys were all charged with sedition after January 6th. But at the time, this was a really big deal in the 80s. It was 1987, and the government lost that case. It was really embarrassed. And so one might argue that the government launched Patcon after they were embarrassed at the sedition trial as a way to get revenge. That's a bit more conspiratorial of a take, but I think that it's actually very plausible as well.
Well, and I believe also being a Scott Horton fan, I've listened to quite a bit of his take on it, and I've also had him on the show. And he had mentioned something about the FBI also having some internal problems being exposed for different things, drug use, different sorts of domestic problems with their agents, and having been accused and proven that a lot of their agents had been directly targeting non-white citizens because they were non-white citizens, just being just shitheads all around, just terrible people, and that they were basically, like you had said, embarrassed, and it kind of seemed like they were getting a bunch of embarrassment all the way around.
Yeah, I think that was certainly the case with ATF and Waco. There was some scandal in a year or two before Waco happened. It was found out that like these ATF agents were, I don't know if they were in the Klan or what, but they were definitely explicitly racist. And I'm not an expert on Waco in itself. I kind of just know how it fits in a more broad historical context of Patcon. But I remember Scott talking about how the ATF, they might have wanted to do, make a big case with Waco to kind of distract from the racist, the scandal of their agents being card-carrying racists.
So at the end of the 80s, it seemed like they took care of the problem that was justified, or took care of the reason for the justification. And I guess somebody who doesn't know about this, it is confirmed that this program did exist. Is that correct?
Oh yeah, there's FBI records that have the Patcon acronym on them, and these came out, I think, from Terry Nichols' state trial, one of the Oklahoma City bombers. Some records came out, and then there's a Utah attorney named Jesse Trenadu who has been suing the FBI for records about Patcon for 15 years now. And one of the informants from Patcon actually came out as a whistleblower and was going to testify for Jesse in one of his trials, which is a whole nother tangent. But yeah, this is, nobody even argues that Patcon doesn't exist. It's definitely exists. The only question is, was it a domestic spying program, or was it something more nefarious? Was it actually designed to provoke right-wing violence? And at first I might have leaned towards the former, but I would probably tend to lean towards the latter after studying it for the last 2 years.
So it began in the mid to late 80s, and then what is the role of Patcon in the 90s? Because
Yeah,
it kind of seems like that's where it really picked up steam.
yeah, I wouldn't call it Patcon in the 80s because I do think the FBI's response to the order was warranted. Patcon, I would say you could argue it started probably in 1988, maybe, because or 87 is when Andreas Strassmeyer comes into the country, and he's like this German guy with a lot of intelligence connections, seen with McVey, thought to be by many an undercover intelligence asset. But yeah, so Patcon officially starts in 1991, and I think the investigatory rationale was they were probing stolen military equipment. A lot of the reservists and veterans were stealing night vision goggles and other equipment from their bases and selling it in gun shows and these kind of underground right-wing swap meets. So that was kind of the justification for why they launched it.
And for anyone who either wasn't there or doesn't remember, the militia movement kind of like very rapidly grew in the 90s. So that kind of just seemed like it all played into it. So do you believe that that was because of this, or was it a natural growth and then they kind of just piggybacked on that?
Part of the reason for the militia movement was the atmosphere of the 80s, which you got to remember was also during Iran Contra. And they were sending all these private soldiers of fortune down to Nicaragua. So there was a lot of private militias just because of like Iran Contra and weird stuff like that, which might have something to do with the 90s militia movement. But I wouldn't say Patcon heavily energized the militia movement because I think there's a lot of organic interest in that. But I can tell you that they basically subsidized the growth of the Aryan nations, which is a neo-Nazi kind of slash Christian far right sect that believes in Christian identitarianism. You know, they think they're the true Israelites. Jewish people don't have souls. Black people they call mud people. And this group was basically dismantled by the FBI by the end of the 80s. They were very much Aryan nations. The Order, those bank robbers, was like an offshoot of Aryan nations. So a lot of ties to domestic terrorism with this group. And they were basically in shambles after the sedition trial in the late 80s. But in the early 90s, after the FBI launches Patcon, the group comes back onto the map in big time. I think they were down to like 3 state chapters, and by 1995 they were all back in 50 states. And thanks to the great author Aberration in the Heartland of the Real, Wendy Painting, she provided me an excerpt of an interview she did with one of the Aryan Nations members from that time, who said that the FBI was spreading cash everywhere. Like, they wanted to make sure that neo-Nazi skinhead in Philadelphia could make the World Congress in Idaho. So they were funding the travel and everything. And it was basically, I've got an article on it at the Libertarian Institute. In fact, it really looks like the FBI purposely subsidized the Aryan nations in the 90s just to put it back on the map and inflate the so-called Nazi threat.
So they destroy the Nazi threat, a legitimate movement at one time, and then they come in only to grow it, to create it basically from nothing.
That's exactly right. And I should say, so Patcon was initially predicated on the stolen military equipment. Another thing that the records say they were worried about is the order coming back. They were worried that the Nazis were trying to start the order again. But I've got a book. Actually, I've got it right here. I could show it up. A book from an Aryan Nations guy. This is after the Oklahoma City bombing. He I'm reading this, and one of the informants from Patcon is quoted not in his capacity as an informant in this book, but he's presented as a real Aryan Nations member, and he's talking about we need to start the order again and start robbing banks. And I was shocked because this book was written before the Patcon records were made public. So you combine this book with the Patcon records, and you see clearly that their own informants were trying to start the order again. I mean, it's just absolutely insane.
So after studying it for so long, what do you believe was their justification for kind of stoking the fire, I guess?
Whew, that's that's a question I still haven't really come to a firm answer on. I would give the innocuous reason that they've got this, they take down the order. Congress is giving them money for domestic terrorism, and they need to create cases. I don't think it's that simple, but I probably couldn't articulate what I really believe intelligently. So I'll leave it at that for now. I think, you know, it's a big sting operation. They want to create like the Whitmer plot. You set up some
Yeah.
kind of plot and bust it before it happens, make good headlines, get promotions, everybody goes home happy.
Well, and that is something I wanted to touch on, is that this is still going on, which is kind of where our conversation started, as well as some newer articles that you would come out with, which we will definitely talk about at some point, as that kind of spurred this idea of doing a show. Um, but it seems as though they haven't stopped, even though have they come out officially to say that it ended, kind of like they did with MK Ultra? They were like, well, it ended, but in actuality there's plenty of evidence that it never did.
No, they've never said that, and they've never even acknowledged Patcon publicly. Um, but you're very much right. It's never ended. And like I said, the official operation called Patcon closed in 1993. But me and a lot of other researchers still use that word just because it's a pretty appropriate, patriot conspiracy. It kind of is a good way to describe kind of a 30-year phenomenon where the FBI has been provoking right-wing violence. And we know it's still going on because one of the informants that was in the Aryan Nations coming out of the 90s is still an FBI informant in the right-wing movement. His name's Joshua Caleb Sutter, and he became kind of internet famous a couple years ago when it was revealed that he was an informant who runs a satanic bookstore down in South Carolina, and he's made more than $100,000 in his career working for the FBI. So basically, the FBI is subsidizing satanic literature. And there's a lot of details that we could really get into if you really want to dig into the history from 1995 to current day. But one of the key actors that people should know his name is this Joshua Caleb Sutter guy, because he carries the story forward in a big way.
And I swear it always comes back to the Satanists at one point or another in all of these stories.
It's really, really interesting studying it. It's because with the order in the 1980s, there was a big conflict between the Christian identitarians and pagans. Like the head of the order was Bob Matthews, and he was into the European Aryan bloodline, Odinism type of religion, and it kind of split. You kind of fractured the right wing movement to a minor extent in the 80s, where the Christians were fighting the pagans. And you kind of have that on steroids today, where instead of Christians versus the pagans, it's kind of the Christians and pagans on one side. And then these Satanists are either infiltrating the right wing groups, or in some cases, they're actually forming alliances. But the dynamics of these various strains of ideology and how they fight each other are just another thing that worth studying when it comes to
No.
cases.
So before we get too far along into the 2000s and up to today, what was Timothy McVeigh's connection, if any, to a lot of the militia movement or people that could have even been Patcon adjacent?
Okay, yeah, we should probably spend some time on this because I think this is probably the most important thing about Patcon is that a whistleblower who worked in Patcon as an undercover informant came out around 2010 and said that basically the FBI was monitoring McVey leading up to the bombing as part of Patcon. And so the informant, John Matthews, says he saw Timothy McVey with Andreas Strassmeyer at a militia training exercise in 1994. At the time, he didn't know the significance of McVey, but after the bombing happens, he sees McVey's face and is like, whoa, that's the guy I saw with Andy Strassmeyer. And so he calls his handler agent and tells him this, and the FBI agent says, oh, we already knew that, we're on this. And to the informant, that meant to him that they had been monitoring McVey for some time. I think it gets a lot deeper than that, though, because, okay, Strassmeyer, as I said, was a German guy with weird intelligence connections, including to Israel. He somehow winds up in a white supremacist kind of compound / property called Elohim City in the early 90s, where McVey was also seen, including by the FBI, visiting there. Now, this is where it gets really weird because at Elohim City, that was kind of the hideout for an Aryan bank robbery gang, not one that we've discussed. This wasn't the Order and it wasn't the undercover FBI agents. This is a separate gang called the Aryan Republican Army. But yes, they were inspired by the Order. And I've got real questions of whether they were like a Patcon operation or whether they were actually real, diehard Nazis who actually believed what they were purporting to believe. So Strassmeyer is at Elohim City, and he was actually roommates with one of these Aryan bank robbers and temporarily roommates with at least two others. And so you've got McVeigh's connections to Strassmeyer's connection to these bank robbers. And then to top it off, you have letters from Timothy McVey to his sister where he says, I'm actually in a gang and we rob banks to fund our activities. He sent her some bills to launder. So the belief among researchers I trust, as well as my own research, is that McVey was probably participated in several bank robberies with this Aryan Republican Army to help fund the bombing. And all this was done right underneath the FBI's nose at Elohim City. You could cut me off if you have more questions, but I'll keep going for now. Another thing that people need to know about Elohim City is they had an undercover informant there, the ATF did, named Carol Howe. She warned her handlers in like January 95 that Andreas Strassmeyer and these Aryan Republican bank robbers had been casing the Mueller building. They were casing federal buildings in Oklahoma, planning to attack. And she was ignored, and the attack obviously went off and killed 168 people, including 19 babies. We know this is true because Carol Howe, they later tried to arrest her on explosive charges, and her handler testified at her trial that, yes, it was true. Carol warned us about the attack. So I know that was a lot. That's a lot of different names and
yes,
and connections, but I mean, it's all related to Patcon, and it all points at some kind of sting operation that probably went wrong, and which is why the bombing at Oklahoma City happened.
So the FBI, correct me if I'm wrong, that the FBI at some point had involvement with the bank robbers. Is that correct?
Yeah. And
so at what point did they get involved? Was that before Oklahoma City, or was that more after?
I believe it was before. And again, it gets even weirder. Patcon was,
Always.
these undercover agents in Patcon were pretending to be a bank robbery group called the Veterans Aryan.
Yeah.
Separately, you had the Aryan Republican Army. You just asked, when did the FBI actually infiltrate these guys, and when did they know about them? Well, the thing about that is the Aryan Republican Army leader was a guy named Peter Langen, who had been a Secret Service informant. So Peter Langen, he was arrested with Richard Lee Guthrie, or no, he was arrested on his own for robbing a Pizza Hut. He goes to jail, and the Secret Service tells him, hey, we'll make you an informant if you help us catch your buddy, Richard Lee Guthrie, who was threatening to assassinate George Bush at the time. Langen agrees to become an informant. They let him out of jail, but somehow they lose track of him, and he supposedly goes rogue and creates the Aryan Republican Army, and then they go on to have connections with McVey, rob 19 banks, hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund the Aryan Nation and other groups. So an informant did start that gang, and the question was, is the government story true? Did he really go rogue, or was the government kind of letting him do that because they knew they'd be able to create this big case out of it? There is one damning FBI record where a jailhouse informant warned the FBI that Langen, when he was in jail, was saying, if they ever let me out, I'm going to war against the government. And they let him out anyways. So I think that's pretty compelling evidence that they knew about this from the very beginning, and this was an operation. I don't know if that for true, but I think what I just told you, it sounds pretty damning to me.
Well, it's not that much of a leap either, though, is the thing. It's not like that's this huge fantastical claim with what is known, what is proven, and also their they being the FBI, their history of doing certain things like this, which is also proven in other aspects. At this point, I do believe that it is known for a fact that people like Charles Manson were easily let go intentionally, even though he should have been locked up several times over. And so I don't think it's that big of a claim to say that the FBI either let them out intentionally, or, well, it seems like more intentional than it was incompetence at that point, just because of what they could possibly benefit from.
Yeah, and that's funny you mentioned Charles Manson, because there are some similarities between Manson and Peter Langen. Not in terms of violence. Actually, Langen wasn't a violent guy. Neither were the bank robbers. They never hurt anybody in all their robberies. They were actually, as far as neo-Nazi bank robbers go, they were kind of a fun-loving group who would bust into banks and wearing the president's masks and, make jokes about it, say dumb stuff like "thank you very much" on their way out. Kind of just like goofy clown guys. But Langen was the son of a CIA agent, and he was in Vietnam, and he was on top of an embassy rooftop when the monk burned himself to death. This is all in a book written by an Indiana University criminologist called Mark Ham. The book's called In Bad Company. But Langen describes being like a 5-year-old boy and smelling the burning flesh. They come back to America after Vietnam, and he becomes a very troubled child, taking LSD as early as like 12 years old, which again, son of a CIA agent doing heavy LSD. Gee, what does that sound like?
Yeah.
He eventually gets sent to prison at like age of 16 and gets raped in a men's prison. And now, eventually, he was apprehended after the bank robberies, and now he is actually the first prison inmate in history to get a taxpayer-funded sex change. His name's Donna now. He's like a transgender rights champion. But I just say that all to, strike the Manson comparison, where these are incredibly suggestible and damaged people who have done heavy drug use and are heavily traumatized. So
Yeah.
sounds very plausible that the government could have been running this guy as an asset and he just didn't know it. I don't think that he was like cognizant of that he was like an undercover double agent or something like that. But I think he was
Yeah.
taken advantage of.
Well, and they don't really have to be um, aware of a lot of these things for the intelligence community to benefit from running people like this. So, I mean, it kind of seems like even if it was started with the best of intentions, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But if they were trying to create the problem, justifying their paychecks, and therefore even growth of the organization itself, letting somebody out like this, regardless of what they're trying to do, I mean, there's motive, and they've done it with other people before. So I really don't think it's that big of a step to say that that's most likely what happened.
Yeah, and even if they didn't do it on purpose, we know they covered it up because they didn't prosecute any of the bank robbers for helping fund the bombing. Because if they would have done it, that would have been an admission that, hey, our own informant helped fund the bombing. At the very least, people would have been fired. People in the government probably would have gone to jail too. So
Yeah.
even if it was an accident, the cover up's real and it's inexcusable.
Well, and it seems like a lot of people had made their career off of the results of Waco, Ruby Ridge, Oklahoma City, a lot of these things. And so instead of being reprimanded, they got a career out of it and moved up the ladder.
Including our current sitting attorney general. It's kind of ironic. Yeah, after January 6th, he gets appointed as Biden's AG, and he says white supremacism's the greatest threat to America, and that's going to be the Justice Department's priority. Well, that's the same guy who helped prosecute McVey in 1995 and 96. And so I think our friend Richard Booth makes a great point when he says, if you really want to focus on white supremacism, finish the work you were doing 30 years ago and punish the Nazis who killed 168 Americans on April 19th, 95. I mean, that should be his first job before he does anything about January 6th. Let's do actual real terrorism.
Yeah. So I do know that there was a plot to target the same Mariah building, federal building in Oklahoma City before. Was that related to all of this?
Oh, that's a great question. Thanks for reminding me that. That in 1983, or maybe it was 84 or 85. Yeah, it was a group called the Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord, I think was the name, CSA. And they had a kind of a paramilitary camp in the Ozarks in Arkansas, I think. I think it was kind of close to Elohim City. It was in that area in the Ozarks. And they were an organic, legit right-wing extremist group that had ties to the order. I think a guy named Randall Rader, he was like the armorer for CSA, eventually worked for the order and helped manufacture some machine gun that was used in one of the order's assassinations of a Jewish radio host. They were pretty organic, and they did have real ties to the right-wing extremism group. And the case you referenced is they did have a plot to attack the Mueller building in the 80s. They're going to use a dump truck and shoot a missile out the back, but when they were building the bomb, one of the guys blew its own hand off, and they took that as a sign from God to not do this plot. A lot of those guys had direct connections to McVey 10 years later when the Mueller building was attacked. Specifically, the most interesting guy I think people need to know about is Richard Wayne Snell, who was a member of the CSA, and uh, he was eventually murdered a black Arkansas state trooper and goes to jail for that, gets the death penalty, and he on April 19th, 1995 was the day he was set to die. So one feeling is that the Oklahoma City bombing might have actually been retaliation for them killing Richard Wayne Snell on that date, as opposed to other theories like Waco, revenge for Waco. But the most interesting thing about Snell is that on April 19th, 95, the day that he's going to get a lethal injection, he's saying, "Hey, turn on CNN. Something big's going to happen." And then the bombing goes off, and he's so happy, like, "Oh, I told you." And then later in the day, he tells his last words are, "Oklahoma's governor, I wouldn't trade places with you for anything in the world. Hail his victory. Your day is coming." And so basically, he knew the attack from within jail. He knew the attack was going to happen. Now, how did he know that? His spiritual advisor was Robert Millar, the head of Elohim City, where Strassmeyer, McVey, and the Aryan Republican Army guys were hiding out. So I believe that the head of Elohim City knew it was going to happen and relayed that to Snell in jail. But yeah, so that's kind of your connection from that 85 CSA plot to 10 years later. Again, just every rock you underturn from that time leads back to the Oklahoma City bombing. It's pretty fascinating.
Well, and I'm not sure if this has anything to do with it, but there at one point was I believe it was a woman who had authored a book, and I believe it was a fictional book about an attack on the exact same building. The person had been caught and was even named Timothy McVey, and she had authored that book beforehand, I believe.
That was the brother. Yeah, you're asking all the right questions. First of all, I'll mention that these plots to attack federal buildings was based off of a book called The Turner Diaries, written by William Pierce, who is a far right wing white supremacist guy who wrote this, I think, in like the late 70s. That's kind of the inspiration for a lot of these people. But the book you're referring to was written by Oklahoma Governor Frank Keating's brother, like a couple years before the attack. And the guy, yeah, it was like James McVey was the character's name.
Yep.
Evey. And yeah, they attacked the bombing. They attacked the building in the same way that actually happened. And yeah, I don't know what to make of that, but it's really strange. And I think we should also mention that Governor Keating was a former FBI agent. So, I mean, this kind of stuff will make, like, when you tell people this for the first time, you just sound like an absolute nutter. But all this is true. People could go find the articles about this on the Libertarian Institute. There's like articles in the Washington Post about, oh, isn't this a crazy coincidence that the governor's brother wrote a novel describing what would happen? I mean, it's stuff that'll make you go crazy if you're not approach it so with sobriety.
Yeah, I highly recommend the archive over at the Libertarian Institute, and I think when we're done with this, I'll make sure and include that in the episode description, because it's an incredible archive of just everything you can possibly think of. It raises way more questions than it answers anything. So is there any thought behind John Doe number 2 and his possible involvement in this?
Oh, are there thoughts? Well, initially, let's just explain who John Doe number 2 is. He's the guy seen by over 20 witnesses on the day of the attack, April 19th, 95, in the Ryder truck with McVey. This is kind of not even disputed anymore, really. Like, people, even liberals who study this will say, yeah, John Doe 2 exists. There were others involved. the government initially put out a giant manhunt when they caught McVey. They said, well, hey, John Doe 2 is still at large. There's a clip of Attorney General Janet Reno talking about this. And yeah, the question is, why did they never catch John Doe 2, or why do now the DOJ's official position is he doesn't exist? And I think the most reasonable explanation is that he was some kind of undercover government agent. And I use the word agent purposely because if this guy was an informant, I think the government would have just burned him and either killed him or thrown him in jail for something else without admitting their mistake. But as far as who this guy might be, we really don't know. A lot of the Aryan Republican Army guys were early suspects for being John Doe 2. One specific guy, Mike Brescia, looks like him and looks a lot like him in black and white, kind of a younger guy that lifted at the time. But if you look at him in color, he's very pale. So he couldn't be John Doe 2 because John Doe 2 was described as almost Cuban looking. Yeah, we really don't know who he is, but we know that he exists, and the government almost sabotaged their investigation into him on purpose. I mean, at one point, they accused Terry Nichols' 12-year-old son of being John Doe 2. And
geez.
Yeah, when they did that, they halted the investigation for like a week when they thought for sure that Terry Nichols' kid was John Doe 2. And so the investigation pretty much went cold when they made that mistake. Why did they do that? Maybe they were trying to pressure Terry Nichols into cooperating. We don't really know, but it did ruin the son's life. The son's in jail now in Las Vegas for he's like a career criminal and drug addict. But I think his own father ruined his life, but the FBI certainly didn't help by accusing him of being a terrorist.
Yeah, I bet. I couldn't even imagine trying to live a life or get a job after that. You couldn't.
Yeah.
It's just highly unfortunate. So what was the overall connection with Terry Nichols? Because it seems just strange considering, at least to me, it's obvious that there was a lot more intelligence involvement in this than obviously the official story would like anyone to believe. So was Terry Nichols more of a bystander? Was he organically involved, or is there any connection with him?
Yeah, Terry Nichols, you could say, was organically involved, I think. He was in McVey's military unit, which bizarrely was an experimental unit. And by that, I mean they set up a unit specifically where once you're in it, the same people are together for their whole tour of duty. I was never in the military, but it's my understanding that you bounce around a lot. And you might be with some guys for 3 months, and then you'll move across the country and meet a whole new set of faces. That wasn't the case with Nichols, McVey, and another accomplice, Michael Fortier. They were all in the same unit for their whole tour through the Iraq War, going to Germany. They kind of grew really close together. And the guy who wrote the book about Peter Langan said, if not for this experimental unit, the bombing might not have ever happened because they wouldn't have formed such close bonds. In any event, that's how they all got to know each other. And from what I've read, Nichols was a very meek and suggestible guy who you could bully. So I think McVey kind of used him to do a lot of his dirty work. And the most when you ask about, connections to intelligence assets, the spookiest thing I can tell you about Terry Nichols is that he was the guy who McVey sent to rob his supposed friend from a gun show circuit, a guy named Roger Moore. Terry Nichols went to his house, and he was supposed to rob this guy. He was a millionaire, or rob all his guns and jewels to help fund the bombing. Nichols later said he got there and basically Roger Moore handed him the stuff and said, "Hey, get out of here." I found that very unusual. But it's not as unusual when you realize that Roger Moore was actually a CIA asset involved in Iran Contra, built boats for the CIA in the 70s and early 80s, was in one of these militias that went down to Nicaragua. And so very, very tied into the CIA. He was also an FBI informant. And the feeling was that that was part of the sting operation where he gave Nichols all that stuff to fund the bombing with the goal of, I guess they were trying to stop it. Um, yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question exactly, but that's just a little bit about Nichols and his run-ins with various intelligence agents. I think he was a guy that kind of got bullied into something way over his head, and he's still in Supermax now, but unfortunately, they won't let him talk to the media or anybody like me.
So it kind of seems like he was a useful idiot.
Yeah, he was probably the fall guy where when people say, "Hey, there were other people besides McVey involved," the official story could point at, "Oh, well, Terry Nichols too," and then leave it at that.
Yeah. It, yeah, it does seem pretty convenient for the official story, anyways.
Yeah. And I should mention that we know for a fact that he was in Kansas on the day of the bombing, so he could not have been John Doe 2, and he wasn't even directly involved in the attack. He helped build the bomb, is what he did.
So I feel like you can't talk about Oklahoma City without mentioning Terrence Yeekey or Kenneth Trinidad. Um, so first, Terrence Yeekey, um, what is your personal opinion on this situation?
Yeah, Terrence Yeekey was one of the first responders to the bombing, and he later was telling people around him, the official story isn't true, and something a lot darker happened. He ends up dead. What is it, 97? He's found in a field. I think he supposedly shot himself, cut his own wrists, walked like a half a mile.
Strangled himself.
Yeah, just obviously he was murdered, and I think he was probably had information about John Doe too. I know Richard Booth and Jose Galisan talk a lot about how he had two VCRs at one point. He borrowed somebody's VCR, and they think that he was trying to copy some of the surveillance tapes because at the time, you play the one tape in the VCR and you play your blank tape to get it copied over.
Yep.
So that's kind of the theory uh, of what happened with Yeekey. I got to say I'm not an expert on that case because it's kind of more about the aftermath of the bombing and the local
Yeah.
stuff that happened. It doesn't really directly tie into Patcon, but Kenneth Trinidad does.
So where does he come in? And just for anybody curious, I will have Jose on at some point to talk about all of this as well. But also make sure and go check out his channel, No Way Jose. Him and I have been doing a series on false memory syndrome and all of that nonsense. But he covers the Oklahoma City bombing in a very unique and but very informative way. He's like one of the guys, one of a couple of handfuls. So make sure and go check out his channel. So Kenneth Trinidad, how does he tie into this? Because he's just like Yeekey, where it's just seems like a really unfortunate accident, as the feds would have us believe, but it's no accident.
Yeah, Kenneth Trinidad just found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time. Uh, he grew up hillbilly in West Virginia, was a really fast. Him and his brother were like star track runners. They go over to California. They both were, top athletes in high school. He eventually signs up to go over to Vietnam, but at the time, apparently, he developed some kind of drug problem. And to kind of satisfy his urges, he robbed banks. Went to jail for that in the 80s. This has nothing to do with terrorism or anything. He was just a kind of a low level criminal at the time, but he did turn around his life. But in the early 90s, after he turned around his life, he caught a very minor infraction, a parole violation. I think he went down to Mexico with his wife from Mexico and was coming back, and that violated his probation. And for some reason, they sent him to the Oklahoma City Transfer Center, which is very bizarre for them to do that to a California inmate for a minor infraction. And this is August 95. He supposedly kills himself, but like Yiki, it's all the hallmarks of a murder. I think he was even like injected with caffeine to like wake him back up. He had beatings on the bottom of his feet. So what the hell is going on here, and what does this have to do with Patcon or the Oklahoma City bombing? And in the 90s, we still didn't know. His brother, Jesse Trinidad, was fighting the government for, suing the government for the wrongful death. He eventually wins $1 million, but he still doesn't really know what happened. He just knows that something went terribly wrong. But he gets a message supposedly from Timothy McVey saying that the reason that your brother was dead is because the government mistook him for one of the people in the Aryan Republican Army. They thought he was one of the Nazi bank robbers, and his death might have been an interrogation gone wrong, or they might have murdered him because they thought he was one of the undercover informants who could have compromised their whole case. In any event, Jesse Trinidad was told that his brother's death had something to do with the bombing. He took that with a grain of salt. I think he got some kind of phone call from a guy he didn't even know. Until the early 2000s, a journalist named J.D. Cash called him with the same information and said, "Jesse, are you sitting down? Your brother, did he have a dragon tattoo on his right arm? How big was he?" And basically, J.D. Cash put together the dots saying that your brother probably resembled Richard Lee Guthrie, one of the Aryan bank robbers, who, by the way, also ended up committing suicide, in quotes, in prison days before he was going to be interviewed by the LA Times. So that's Kenneth, and the significance of him beyond all what I've just told you is that his brother is a badass retired Marine turned lawyer, one of the best lawyers in the country, who basically dedicated the next 20 years of his career to just suing the FBI for records about Patcon and the Aryan Republican Army and all these issues in an attempt to solve his brother's murder and just to get revenge for what they put his family through. And it's a lot of what Jesse's, the records that he's gotten has kind of underpinned a lot of what I've told you today.
And I believe he is still selling. Sorry, I was reading that word. He's still suing the federal government over this, I believe. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, he filed a lawsuit earlier this year for records on Roger Moore, the guy that Terry Nichols supposedly robbed, but who in fact is a CIA asset. And he filed a lawsuit for records on the Aryan Republican Army, specifically for any records where the FBI is investigating whether the Republican Army was involved in the bombing. So that lawsuit he filed because they've been ignoring a FOIA request he filed like 10 years ago. The far more interesting lawsuit has been going on for like 20 years. And in fact, he was going to have one of the Patcon informants testify for him in 2014 about the FBI monitoring McVey ahead of the bombing. The night before the trial, though, the informant backs out and tells Jesse that the FBI threatened him and told him that you're going to be a homeless Vietnam vet if you testify for Jesse. Will ruin your life. And Jesse filed a complaint for witness tampering. And that's been under investigation for 9 years now, almost 10 years. A court has actually appointed a special master, which is a federal judge that's appointed specifically to investigate a specific issue within a larger case. So the special master has been, I guess, hearing from what Jesse's complaints versus what the FBI has to say about the matter. And he's eventually going to draft a report and release it publicly. And we're going to know what happened with this case and whether the FBI did threaten one of its Patcon informants. That could come out any day. I'm not expecting it to come out before the election, but like I said, this case, just that witness tampering allegation is 9 years old now, so we should get something on it hopefully soon.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely incredible. He's spent his life dedicated to finding out what happened with his brother. Honestly, I'm not much of an emotional guy, but both of those stories, it just hits you right in the feels. Um, it's incredibly sad, and both men genuinely deserve the truth to come out. So hopefully, even just keeping people aware of these cases by talking about it like this, I think is incredibly important. Um, and what so it kind of seems like there's also just a trail of bodies kind of left behind, whether they're stuck in prison, or um, no longer with us. So do you believe that this is to tie up the loose ends?
I can't think of any other reason. I mean, I don't know that for a fact. It could just be random acts of incompetence, but yeah, I just can't think of an alternative explanation. It's all these people that know information that's very damning to the government wind up dead. Uh, yeah, I think it's pretty self-evident at this point, especially after recent cases like the Jeffrey Epstein and things like that.
Yeah. So after Oklahoma City, where does things go from there? Obviously, it seems like things were pretty quiet uh, for a bit, but and now they're not. It seems like I would say ever since maybe ever since 2016, I guess with Trump, um, white supremacists, white nationalists, or Nazis, whatever, have been public enemy number one, artificially so, in my opinion. But somewhere between there and after OKC, what's going on with Patcon in between there?
Uh, the interesting thing about Patcon is I think it might have been designed to even be bigger than OKC. Not more deaths, but I think there might have been a plan to bomb a series of federal buildings. And the book I held up, it touches a little bit about that. It talks about there was a plan to attack, I think, the Earl Cable Building in Dallas, the Dallas Federal Building. So there was like an assortment of characters who were still floating around in 96, 97, 98, and so on. But I just think a lot of the steam was knocked out of the movement due to all the dead babies, and nobody wanted to be involved. Even the most hardcore Nazis were like, hey, this is ridiculous. And furthermore, I think a lot of the steam was knocked out of it after 9/11. You had the FBI just diverted most of its resources towards targeting Muslims. But to get to your question, there were still many undercover operatives and informants in the Nazi movement in the late 90s and the early 2000s. One guy, Jose, and I just interviewed is David Gleddy. He became an FBI informant in 96, and he told us that the FBI wanted to flood the field with informants after the bombing to make sure it didn't happen again, which sounds really plausible to me because I think overall, like the FBI, Patcon was run out of main justice. Like it was probably just a couple guys in DC who knew about it, but I think most of the field offices in the FBI were shocked by the bombing, and so they all activated a bunch of informants to try to prevent something from happening again. But as you say, things were very quiet until I would say things started picking up closer to Obama's candidacy. You had a lot of really racially motivated Nazi protests where they were printing flyers saying "kill this N-word," spelling it out though with a picture of a noose. Really glowing stuff that I also think was organized by the FBI. And we could get into that today if you want, or if you want to do another show. I would open a whole nother can of worms with what happened in like the 2000s and beyond.
Yeah, I definitely want to do another show at some point because I think this to be able to have people understand this and I like the true depth of what we're looking at, because this entirely affects our country, which shit rolls downhill. Um, so I definitely want to do another show at one point, and I think this is important to cover kind of what led up to all of that, because we're going to have a lot more people remember Obama and his presidency, and also his presidency was a turning point. So I think we let me know what you think about this, but we should kind of end on that, and then we can pick that up next episode as well. But just to kind of, I guess, close up the Oklahoma City. Obviously, this would be your opinion or any speculation, but what do you believe personally is like the overall motive for whatever took place?
I think a lot of people had a lot of different motives. I think the FBI probably was motivated to do a sting operation where they were egging on these Nazis to commit a bombing, and they were going to stop it at the last minute. I think some of the Nazis were true diehard believers who really wanted to carry out the attack, regardless of whether they knew they were infiltrated or not. And then, if you want to get a lot darker, I think there might have been a couple people who actually wanted it to happen within the government. And I'm still not sure if you ask for an overall motive. I don't know which one of those are the most dominant. I guess at this point, I would lean towards the story of the FBI trying to do a sting operation and then failing miserably. We know there are at least 2 Ryder trucks involved in the attack. And I believe, based off of reading people like Wendy Painting, talking to Richard Booth, is that the FBI had a tracking device on one of the trucks, but the Nazis knew it and drove the truck with the tracking device out somewhere to cause a wild goose chase all night, the night before the attack, while McVey and John Doe 2 drive the truck up to the Mueller building that morning. And, they blew up the building, obviously. So I think that would be my best guess of what actually happened. And, why was the FBI fooled? Maybe there were some undercover agents or operatives in that movement that were actually told, hey, actually, we're going to fool the FBI and let this happen. And why would they do that? I mean, there's a million different reasons. I think that initially some people wanted to blame it on Saddam Hussein and start, it was been like 9/11 before 9/11, our whole rationale to launch a campaign in the Middle East. There's comments from Bill Clinton about, hey, this really saved my presidency after the bombing. It knocked the steam out of all the right wingers who were criticizing me for Waco and everything like that. Could have been the government the actual law enforcement agencies trying to look better after Waco, saying, hey, we might have fucked up at Waco, but these guys are dangerous and we still need our jobs because look at what happened with Oklahoma City. Those are just a couple ideas I'm still wrestling with.
Personally, I think the last thing that you said is kind of paint themselves in a better light. Definitely plays a part in it. I don't think that that makes sense for the entire thing or their involvement, but before that, I mean, they had such a negative public perception. Um, they were being really dragged through the mud, and I mean, who knows? They could have lost funding. You know, could have been downsized, which I would be in favor of. I'm sure most people would. You know, we could turn Quantico into a dog park, and I would be okay with that. You know, um, but I think that definitely had something to do with it. That turns public perception around 100%, and they're, you know, the public is now demanding that they have somebody like the FBI around, which they shouldn't even exist in the first place, based upon, you know, their conception. They were never meant to be permanent, especially like this. Um, so it definitely seems very plausible to me that they wanted a better public perception. Also, just secure more funding and possibly even grow. I think that's what bothers me the most, is that it seems like through Patcon they are creating their their own reason for existing. I think the institution is aware that they shouldn't exist and that they don't really need to exist. But if there is this big scary boogeyman out there, then it's required for them to exist.
Yeah, and it's pretty scary that we're kind of reliving this exact same atmosphere today, where you got a lot of people on the right who are willing to consider defunding the FBI or downsizing these agencies, kind of neutering them. And so you got to wonder, you know, what if what we're saying has been true, then they still have that same playbook. And what are they planning now to win the public back over to their side? One of the things I saw like 10 minutes before we started talking is they're trying to blame Iran for an alleged plot to kill Trump. And I got to imagine uh, that might be some kind of way to be like, hey, yeah, we messed up trying to kill the president, but it was actually this foreign agency. So we got to rely on the FBI to prevent, you know, Iran from killing the president. That's just one thought that first came to mind. I'm certainly not reporting that or anything.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's incredibly interesting because of what you had just said, that there was you know, some people trying to blame Saddam Hussein for Oklahoma City, or just trying to tie that incident with his name. I mean, that people trying to tie what had happened with Trump to Iran. Well, first of all, it doesn't look good, as it seems like there's this group of neocons who are always constantly trying to find a way to go to war with Iran. And it's been that way my entire life. Any chance they get, they try to drop the name of that country or some leader from that country to be able to drum up public support to go to war with them, and that's incredibly scary.
Yeah.
And we also know that they do these things. I mean, as far back as Woodrow Wilson, who had hired Edward Bernays to change public perception to sell war. So that's, once again, not that far of a leap to make. And I think it's incredibly interesting they're still trying the same thing.
Yeah, it's just hopefully the American public finally wakes up to it. The last couple of days I've seen a lot of good good takes coming from people in terms of being suspicious about the federal government, but you know how the public is. The next big thing happens and everybody totally buys into it, and all of a sudden the FBI is the darling of the right again. I mean, that's exactly what happened in the 90s. The right wingers hated the FBI. Then after 9/11, they all cheerlead as a decade campaign of entrapping Muslims. So, you know, could hope, but I'm not really holding my breath. I think
Yeah.
we'll probably just have to wait until the system collapses under its own weight.
Under its own bullshit.
Yeah.
So I did actually want to ask you, what other parallels do you see happening now between what has already happened? Obviously, we just mentioned the Iran thing, but do you notice any other parallels, either with the incident that just happened with Trump or any other recent incident?
As far as Trump goes, I mean, I think we got to look at MK Ultra and this shooter. I know he had a Discord channel, and a lot of these mass shooters have had Discord channels, and they've had contact with feds, and there's questions of whether these people were kind of groomed or encouraged to do these shootings. So that's one thing that I'm looking at. That's not really a historical parallel as much. That's kind of a new frontier. But the biggest thing that's going on right now that smells like Patcon is the gun running, the ATF Operation Fast and Furious, which that's very much going on today. We have whistleblower. They don't get much coverage at all, but basically the ATF is allowing illegal gun sales. Why, we don't exactly know, but they're pretty much, you've got informants at gun stores calling up the ATF saying, hey, some guy with Sinaloa license plates just came to my Arizona gun store, bought 20 ARs, and now he's heading back to Mexico. He lied on the form. Let's bust this guy before he escapes the country. And the ATF will take that to the U.S. attorneys and say, hey, let's make a case and arrest this guy real quick. And the DOJ, the U.S. attorney's offices, are saying, hey, well, the nexus of crime is Mexico. These guns are going to Mexico, so it's not really our problem, which is absolutely insane. This has all come out in a whistleblower's book, Peter Fercelli. I think it's called The Deadliest Path. Really great book, but that's still going on. And one of the gun stores from Fast and Furious, like 2012, was also involved in Patcon, according to the whistleblower informant. He said that during Patcon, they were illegally converting rifles into automatics and selling them to like gangs on purpose. And we don't know why. Hopefully more information will come out when the special master issues his report. But that's the biggest thing is the ATF, these operations. They're very much still ongoing.
So I think we'll wrap up here and kind of lead into the next episode. But so you had just come out with part 1 and part 2, an incredible story of what seems like the continuation of Patcon. Do you kind of want to give a synopsis of what kind of story are you trying to tell?
Oh yeah, I'd love to. Basically, I'm trying to tell the story. I'm not trying. It is the story of how Patcon never ended, and I didn't set out to tell that story, but it kind of just stumbled into it, court document by court document. Basically, the story you're referring to is part 1 of the hidden history of Robert Mueller's right-wing terror factory. Mueller was the FBI director from, I think, like September 1st, 2001, like a week before 9/11, all the way to 2013 or so. Basically, I found an FBI informant told me that the FBI was instructing him to stage neo-Nazi rallies in 2005. And it's not just his testimony. I have records proving that the FBI and its informants were holding these rallies. And this predates Obama a little bit. So it's almost like the FBI was trying to restoke Nazism, even though it was still going pretty hard on the Muslims. It was also, I guess, diversifying its portfolio or kind of dipping its toe back into these right-wing counterterrorism cases. But so the FBI holds a series of Nazi rallies, and that was designed to raise the prominence of its own informants, who would go on to infiltrate other groups and make even bigger cases in like the 2010, 11, and 12 era. And then a lot of these same characters and groups would go on to march and commit violence at Charlottesville, and some of them are still active to this very day. So yeah, there's a lot to get into there, but that's kind of the story in a nutshell.
So, Robert Mueller, who famously got a name with I guess the average American due to investigating the Trump-Russia collusion, which, of course, there was no evidence of, even with millions of dollars being spent, hundreds of millions, I believe. And so is it fair to say that this was confirmed, that Patcon, even if it's not by that exact name, is still continuing even at this moment?
Well, that's certainly my argument. I guess it would be for the readers to decide once they read my work whether I prove my thesis or not. But yeah, I certainly think that after Patcon officially ended around 98 is when the informant whistleblower stopped working for the FBI. It still maintained operatives and informants, and they were kind of just collecting intelligence for the FBI. There wasn't many cases being made, but it was around the Obama era is when Patcon began in earnest in terms of actual sting operations. One of the more interesting ones is part 2, where I talk about the FBI launched a literal neo-Nazi motorcycle front group tied again to the Aryan nations, which was decimated once in the 90s. They launched Patcon and it gets back on the map. Then after the bombing, it's decimated again. By the early 2000s, it's in total shambles. But then the FBI launches this motorcycle front group. One of the ostensible rationales for that was the motorcyclists, the bikers would be paying dues, and that would help, finance the Aryan nations again. That didn't quite work out. The Aryan nations is still just a kind of a group in name only. It doesn't really exist. It's I think like one guy owns the trademark right now. He lives like in a mobile home. But that to me, I think that's basically, it was directly Patcon. I mean, undercover FBI agents posing as Aryans, terrorists, except this time they were outlaw bikers instead of, the bank robbers of the 90s. I believe it was definitely Patcon and everything but the official title.
Now, who is David Gletty? What is his connection?
David Gletty was an FBI informant who organized a Nazi rally in Orlando in 2005. A year later, or maybe he had organized it in 2006. A year later, after he helped set up a couple Confederate hammer skins in another separate case, his cover was blown in open court, and a reporter for the Orlando Sentinel, once he heard the name David Gletty, he realized, oh, that's the guy who signed the permit to organize the Nazi rally a year earlier. So the Orlando Sentinel runs a big story saying FBI informant organized neo-Nazi rally. And at the time, the FBI, I think an agent testified in court that no, he might have signed the permit and marched in it, but the FBI is not doing these kind of things. They don't actually organize these. I eventually tracked down the informant just a couple months ago, and he told me a whole nother story that yes, the FBI actually did instruct him to hold that informant or to hold that rally. Sorry. So the informant Gleddy basically implicated his handler in perjury. Uh, First of all, second of all, the Gleddy, he told me and Jose a number of just jaw dropping revelations about how his work with the FBI, which ran from like 96 to 2006. And we've only got one or two criminal cases where he's involved in. The rest of the time, he was basically acting as a spy. And yeah, I think people should go check out Jose's show for more details on that interview. But one of the most interesting characters I've ever spoken to.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with you there. Other than speaking with him, but listening to him, it was absolutely incredible. Before we wrap up, I did want to bring your post up. You had posted a 1-minute clip from the interview you and Jose did. I wanted to play that for the audience real quick. Hopefully, it entices them more. I would be surprised if they weren't already enticed. But we'll wrap up on this. But I thought it was incredibly interesting. So let's see here. Let's make sure. All right.
One of my family knew. So when I got exposed, it was a big deal for a little while. I'm all over the news, CNN, my hometown newspaper. It was a big deal because at the time, the FBI, just before that, was having me put on Nazi protests. And there was Nazi protests going on across the country that were handled by the FBI and operatives like myself. And that when I took the step out there, because I had to get the permits in my name, if you check the records, the permits for the Orlando, Florida Nazi protest in 2005 was in my name. And I was all over the newspaper, and people that knew me was like, oh my God, what happened to David Gleddy? I used to go out with him in high school. You know, my mom's like, David, what the happened to you? I just saw the newspaper, you're having a Nazi protest. I didn't raise you like that. And I was all in. That was the first time, you know, when you get your picture in the newspaper as a Nazi and you're having a Nazi protest, you're all in. I had events at my home that I still live in. I have 2 homes.
So that was a clip from the interview with you and Jose of No Way Jose with David Gleddy. Make sure and go check that out, listeners and viewers. It's just a 1-minute clip, and even that was just jaw-dropping. How did you feel hearing that?
So once I tracked him down, I did just an interview over the phone with him, and he told me basically everything he told Jose. And I just like, we got to get this guy on video so everybody could hear it. Because if I quote him and write it for my article, yeah, that's great. But I think psychologically, it just hits on a different level when you see it coming from his mouth. And yeah, absolutely amazing. One of my biggest questions is why this guy isn't being called by House Republicans to testify. They're supposedly want to do all this stuff about FBI accountability, but then they go on these wild goose chases about, you know, spying on school board parents, which, you know, the legitimate issues, but nobody got thrown in jail. No parents are in jail because of that. Nobody's dead because of that. They shy away from the real stuff. I think they need to be talking to a guy like David Gleddy.
Well, it definitely kind of seems like even if, you know, these parents at school board meetings and stuff should be something that they investigate, it kind of seems like this is something that they actually need to focus their energy on. Whereas in, you know, the school board meetings, I mean, depending on the situation, I'm not even sure their involvement outside of local law enforcement is even needed in certain cases. So it's like, even if it is, this seems way more pressing. And with, even though they still have tons of resources, it's not unlimited, although I guess it could be. But they should be focusing what resources they have on this, which supposedly, white supremacists and Nazis are enemy number one. So it kind of is interesting while while you guys can get this, and he's not being called in front of Congress, like you just said.
It's crazy. It's crazy. And I even had a supposed FBI whistleblower called the guy a fraud, and people are trying to downplay it. I'd be total speculation, but I think what's going on here is this mid-2000s stuff was also heavily promoted by Israel, and we all know the GOP's in Israel's pocket. And I don't just say that. One of the undercover agents who was in the motorcycle front group literally was sent to Israel to be trained. And the ADL had its own informants at those Nazi rallies in Orlando and elsewhere. So it's to be almost like a joint ADL FBI operation, in my opinion. And I think that might be, I won't throw him under the bus, but one journalist with 1 million followers initially reached out to me and expressed interest in covering these Nazi rallies. And I sent him all the documents and everything. And then he asked me, are groups like the ADL and SPLC being used as front groups by the FBI or as like kind of intelligence cutouts? I said, well, I think it's actually kind of the other way around. It's Israel using the FBI as a cutout. And I never got a response from them. I think that might be a little bit of what's going on there.
Yeah. I mean, that would stand to reason. That's, even though what we know now, that still seems to be something that most journalists don't want to touch with a 30-foot pole.
And all right, I'll do my Kanye West. I'll say it was Michael Schellenberger. He ran away from it.
Well, I mean, come on, guys, be better.
Schellenberger still does good PR for the GOP, but he could let real investigative journalists handle the good stuff, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing I will say is, all right, fine, you don't want to cover it. Well, get out of the way of the people who do.
Yeah, exactly.
So, just to finally wrap up, where does part one end? Where does part one of your story end?
Part one of the Robert Mueller terror factories.
Yeah.
That ends. So after the Nazi rallies, the informant that Jose and I spoke to, David Gletty, kind of becomes a famous guy in Florida. Everybody knows him from the rally, and that helps him infiltrate a group called the Confederate Hammerskins, which I guess you could call them white nationalist guys, but they're not really ideological. They're just kind of skinheads who like to do coke, and they go to work 5 days a week and just turn it up on the weekend like nobody else. And he planted the idea in two of the skinhead leaders' heads to rob drug dealers. And so the idea was like, you buy coke from the drug dealer at 5 p.m., you come back at midnight, and then at 4 a.m. on that third visit is when you do the robbery, when the drug dealers are used to you. And so he helps set up to the Hammerskins. They go to court, and that's where his cover is blown. And it was after David Gletty's cover was blown that the FBI decided to launch the motorcycle front group, which is where part two begins. And then part two, the motorcycle front group case eventually expands to target yet another group called the American Front, which was a supposed white supremacist militia in Florida that was allegedly training for a race war. And that's going to be subject of part three, another total FBI setup. But hopefully I'll have that done by the next time we talk.
Yeah. I think that's interesting, the race war thing, because that's also come up in FBI history before. That goes back to Charles Manson. And
yes. And this is directly under Robert Mueller. And I believe like I guess the punchline of part 3 is that if this was a successful Patcon op, it might have knocked the steam out of a Trump movement before Trump was even a thing, because this was like 2012, 2013. I mean, imagine if the feds got a bunch of Nazis in Florida to go out and shoot up black people or Jewish people. Like the political atmosphere would have been made toxic before Trump is even a candidate.
Why do you think? Because at least from my perspective and the way that I've seen things, it doesn't seem like this Nazi thing is taking hold very well. Obviously, there are some people that are always going to believe this, but on the macro scale, it doesn't seem like, I would say, a large majority of people are buying it.
Unfortunately, I'd probably have to disagree with you there. In recent years, I think the Nazi movement is actually I do see some organic growth, assuming that some of the intellectual thought leaders are organic. Be careful who I'm talking crap about, but I mean, our old friend Pete Quinones from the Libertarian Institute, he had to leave because now he's pretty much a card-carrying National Socialist. And not calling him a Nazi as an insult, I think he wouldn't mind that label. And so I think you got a lot of people off-ramping from the Ron Paul movement to a more extreme Nazi movement. And basically their argument is like, we tried to be libertarians for over a decade, but people hate us and want to kill us just for being white. So we got to fight back and use the state against our enemies instead of just being kind of pacifists. So like there is an argument to be made. I think that ultimately backfires. I mean, look, the original Nazis tried to do that in Germany in the 40s and they got totally cucked. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad or necessarily a great strategy, but I do think there are some like actual people who are getting into the ideas just because that's what happens when empires fail. A lot of people turn to communism or Nazism or other fringe ideologies because what we have now certainly isn't working.
Yeah, most definitely. And just for clarification, I definitely agree with you that there seems to be organic growth, even though I think it seems like the organic growth is maybe supplemented with inorganic growth. But the clarification comes with, it doesn't seem like the vast majority of the public is buying that Nazis are really this big of an issue. And I'm not saying that isn't even currently changing, because there for so long has been such lies perpetuated by the mainstream media. Maybe there is a genuine push into kids growing up to be racist or growing up to be Nazis or anything like that, because I mean, they're being called these things. And it's like, well, I might as well just be them because, I'm already being labeled and treated as such. I mean, obviously that's not the smart choice, but it's like, the Nazis are the problem. Oh, you mean all 10 of them in northern Idaho,
Yeah.
And so, maybe it is changing and maybe I am wrong about that, but at least up to now, it seemed like it's like kind of being blown off.
You got to remember though, it was the rationale for Joe Biden's candidacy. It was Charlottesville, and he talked about Nazis. I think he said at the recent debate, materializing out of the forest, which is kind of funny. But yeah, guess what? He got 80 million votes or whatever, and so maybe his votes disagree and actually are afraid of this so-called Nazi problem. But I would agree with you. I think maybe some of the ideological growth is organic, but the terrorism side, the violence side, that I believe that's mostly astroturfed and fomented by the feds.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll wrap up there for now, and then next time we'll recap part one, get into some more details there a little bit, and then dig through part two. Hopefully, you have part three out by that time, and we could touch on that, or you could give us a little preview to kind of tie everything up and whatnot. So any final thoughts that you feel that the general public needs to know about Patcon, or this I would argue this infiltration of disproven ideas at this point?
I guess the only thing, and we'll probably get into this more about in part two, is most of what we discussed, the last 40-year history, is specifically this far right, call it Nazi or white nationalist, or regardless, these are actually right-wing revolutionaries who did want to overthrow the government. And so you do have some kind of a rationale for what the FBI did in terms of launching sting operations or infiltration operations. Obviously, the results of those were disastrous, but I think the more concerning thing is they're applying that playbook to the mainstream. If you want to see like something like the Whitmer plot, they were not targeting Nazis. Those guys actually, some of them met the technical definition of anti-racist because they supported people like Breonna Taylor. So it was the FBI applying the Nazi entrapment book to normal dudes in Michigan who just weren't happy about the lockdowns. And we could see that even more recently with January 6th. I think the FBI is doing these things to more mainstream conservatives, which is definitely something we need to keep our eye on.
Yeah, and for anyone who doesn't know, I have actually had Brandon Cassetta on
Nice.
and interviewed him. Super solid dude. And, just his case alone was so damning to the FBI, in my opinion, that his story needs to be known because he's not alone. I mean, there's so many people that were in his shoes historically and even now that isn't getting the attention that he's getting. Not that he doesn't deserve it or anything like that, because he definitely does. They practically ruined his life, and these people are just getting away with it. I mean, even Gretchen Whitmer was just paraded out in front of everyone as a possible replacement for Joe Biden, which sent chills down my spine. But that's just, it's god awful. So
Yeah.
but hey, Ken, thank you so much for doing this. I'm excited for the next one. Everyone watching, where can they find you?
Twitter at JD_cashless, headlineusa.com, or the Libertarian Institute runs a lot of my stuff too.
Hey, awesome. And once again, everyone watching, go to risetoliberty.com/links. That's the master link that pulls up whatever preferred platform you have. So make sure and go there. I have everything down in the episode description. Make sure and hit up Nadu Shave Company. They're a sponsor of the show, and without a doubt, the best razor you can possibly get. There's a reason our dads and grandfathers used those single blade safety razors for so long. Stop buying Chinese plastic made crap from companies that hate you. There's no reason. So go to Nadu, use promo code RISE15 for 15% off. And I always follow up with my guests because eventually I'm going to get a large supercut of all of these answers. But the question is, why does liberty matter?
Ooh. Because it allows us to have these kinds of conversations. I'm more of a utilitarian guy, so hopefully that doesn't turn your whole listener base against me. I'm not a big rights guy. I'm more of like, what are the consequences? So I think we live in the most prosperous society in the history of the world, and we got liberty to thank for that.
Yeah, I don't think it will turn everyone against you.
Okay.
But no, you're totally good there. And I think that's a great answer. It's the reason we have what we have, and hopefully we're smart enough to keep it, because I think that's what Ben Franklin said is, we have a republic if we're willing to keep it. So, on that note, and then until next time, everyone, thank you for tuning in. Hit that like, hit the subscribe. If you found this valuable in any way, shape, or form, make sure to share it to everybody. Our big tech overlords have made it very difficult to grow, so it's entirely dependent on you getting these conversations out there. So once again, you found this valuable, make sure and share it to anybody possible on any social media. Just get it out there. That's the whole reason I started this show, is these conversations are incredibly important, and want to have more of these conversations, honest conversations that aren't willing to hide from the truth. Got to get it out there. So I appreciate everyone for tuning in. Thank you again, Ken. Hang out so we can wrap up on the back end, and everyone else, until next time, stay free, my friends.